Okay, today I want to discuss something that I've heard a lot of my friends talk about. I've heard a lot of people on social media talk about. It's this concept of starting over in your 30s or maybe your 20s. Many people start over at many different points in their lives, but I want to reframe this whole concept of starting over um, through a concept called existential liquidity. So, this concept is a philosophical lens, the sociological lens for understanding the emotional and the economic and the psychological complexity of starting over in midlife. Contrary to a lot of the motivational narratives of renewal and reinvention, existential liquidity frames the difficulty of starting over not as just a simple act of courage or resolve, but as a liquidity crisis of identity capital. So I wanted that's a lot of complicated concepts kind of combined into one idea, but I want to unpack each one to tease out exactly what is the philosophical context of the what I think is the best way to frame this concept of starting over. So this what is existential liquidity? So this comes from uh, Pierre Bourdieu in Forms of Capital, his book, 1986. Bourdieu identified several dimensions of capital: economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, symbolic capital. And people accumulate and deploy strategically these different forms of capital throughout their lives. Existential liquidity applies this framework to the concept of identity itself. So, highlighting the convertibility of one's accumulated personal resources into alternative viable life paths. So, just as financial liquidity determines the ease of converting assets into cash, existential liquidity measures how readily an individual can transform their accumulated professional skills and social connections and symbolic statuses into meaningful opportunities in new contexts. The less transferable this capital, the greater the existential illiquidity and subsequent desperation in the starting over enterprise. Okay, so that's existential liquidity. It's the ability to transfer or convert one's accumulated personal resources into alternative viable life paths. So, why does so called midlife create liquidity shocks for us at the identity level? So, Richard Sennett's analysis in his book, The Corrosion of Character, 1998, it provides context for understanding how flexible capitalism erodes the predictability and stability of life paths that we once considered linear and cumulative. You see this in the contrast between the typical baby boomer life path and the typical millennial or Gen Z life path, right? Midlife shocks occur because the forms of capital, the social networks, the professional skills, the symbolic status have become highly specialized and context dependent. And when an unexpected shift occurs, like a job loss or a divorce or a relocation, people realize that their their carefully cultivated forms of capital don't easily transfer into new contexts. And this shock is compounded because midlife is especially or typically when individuals expect to kind of reap the benefits of their investments in life capital, right? And you feel this in the forms of despair that are expressed when people say, for the past, what have I been doing for the past 10 years, 15 years? Well, it's not really about what you've been doing. It's not actually about anything. It's just what's happened. The path that you've journeyed on is simply what's happened. How do you rationalize or frame as a liquidity gain, specific events in your life. People say, well, it's all for the best, it's all for the good. Not exactly, right? When the investments in life that you've made are necessarily contextualized, and those investments all of a sudden, due to an event somewhat outside your control, like when those investments lose value unexpectedly, then the emotional toll is not merely disappointment. It can feel like a betrayal that that catalyzes an existential desperation inside of you. It forces you to despair over all the events of your life, and to feel like if things could go so wrong when I tried so hard to plan so well, what's the point of even trying over the next 10, 20, 30 years to build something else? And what we're actually experiencing in our 30s is the realization that the kind of identity that we've built is a radically illiquid one. We didn't really design the lives that we were building and the identities we were constructing and the context we were investing in to be transferable. We kind of bet on the idea that we wouldn't have to convert our assets from one context to a separate one, maybe from one religious community to a non-religious community, maybe from one career context to a non-career context, maybe from a family we grew up thinking we would go through life with forever to alienation, where we don't speak with them anymore, right? Or a future where you imagine that you would have a particular kind of life with a particular kind of partner, and then all of a sudden that's ripped from you, right? And these what these show is that these investments that we've made do not convert, and we have to build again, and we can. In these new contexts, we can kind of remember what we did and reconstruct things and learn lessons and apply things, but those investments are gone. And so this concept of starting over feels not just scary, but is a process of identity reinvention that goes much deeper than the simple act of situational reorganization. So, what's the psychological cost of illiquidity, of existential illiquidity? Well, in Mullainathan and Shafir's work in Scarcity, 2013, their book Scarcity, it highlights the cognitive effects of experiencing resource shortages. So, applied to existential liquidity, midlife individuals facing liquidity crises often fall into a scarcity mindset, and they experience a narrowed cognitive bandwidth that impairs their decision making and catalyzes desperation driven choices. So there's another book, The Ritual Process, 1969, Victor Turner. And Turner introduced this concept of liminality. So liminality is the emotional and social discomfort experienced in transitional states. And midlife reinvention often forces individuals into prolonged periods of liminality, which intensifies psychological strain and emotional exhaustion and identity confusion. So, on the basis of all of these concepts, right, understanding existential liquidity, kind of applying Pierre Bourdieu's forms of capital concepts to identity and existential liquidity itself, right, or applying the concept of forms of liquidity to the identity in the concept of existential liquidity, and then kind of drawing on Sennett's insights from the corrosion of character, right, and how capitalism and flexible capitalism really um, lends a society to experiencing these situational earthquakes and this disruption of value contexts, right, and then moving to Mullainathan and Shafir's work in Scarcity, right, drawing from all of these concepts. I think it's possible for us to kind of critique, and this is why I've been using scare quotes, critique this concept of starting over. right? So there's this book by Eva Illouz called Saving the Modern Soul. Um, the cultural glorification of starting over typically omits the complexity of this existential liquidity crisis. And Illouz, in her book, critiques contemporary culture's promotion of constant self reinvention as a moral imperative. And you see this a lot, right? You see this with people celebrating maybe disruptive forms of life reinvention that you might think traditionally would have been maybe occasions for bereavement or grief, now become moments of celebration, right? As a way to kind of ham fist our way into an optimistic mindset in a painful situation, right? But Illouz argues that this cultural ideal, this ideal of starting over as a virtue, obscures the profound emotional and social disruptions that really accompany genuine and identity shifts. So rather than heroic reinvention, the reality often involves exhausting navigation through diminished existential liquidity, where one's identity and status and skill sets feel suddenly undervalued or irrelevant. So, how do we navigate existential liquidity? So, navigating existential liquidity effectively requires cultivating adaptability as existential resilience. So, there's a sociologist named Hartmut Rosa who has a concept of resonance from her book, Resonance, A Sociology of Our Relationship to the World, 2019. And this offers one practical philosophical frame, which is that to pursue forms of engagement and meaning that remain adaptable and resonant across shifting contexts. So the practical implication is that fostering forms of so-called meta capital, adaptable skills and fluid identity and broader networks and generalized competencies that facilitate smoother transitions between contexts. This is the goal. Cultivating identity meta capital, right? This enables our adaptability, which is the foundation of existential resilience, which provides a foundation for existential liquidity, or a kind of identity that is convertible by nature, by design, right? This means deliberately cultivating identity capital with high convertibility, prioritizing breadth and resonance over narrow specialization. So, so all of this is really to point towards the modern imperative to build an existentially liquid life. So, existential liquidity is not just a useful analytic tool, but an essential philosophical orientation toward contemporary life. So, recognizing the hidden structural realities behind midlife crises reframes desperation as a liquidity issue rather than personal failure or inadequacy. And the existentially liquid life isn't about constantly reinventing oneself, but about cultivating a resilient identity architecture capable of meaningful conversions when life's inevitable disruptions occur. It demands recognizing the true nature of accumulated life capital and investing deliberately in forms of identity that maintain their value across varied contexts. The challenge and the opportunity lies not in endlessly starting over, but in thoughtfully designing lives that retain value and coherence and resonance amid inevitable change.